Thank you for joining us today. This is Pat Wagner with Patterned Research in Denver, Colorado, and my program for DoSpace is How to Manage Information Overload. And I want to tell you the image I have of a mountain. That is the most dangerous mountain in the world. You can look it up, Annapurna. It's one of the mountains in the Himalaya chain, and it's considered, even though it's not the tallest mountain in the world, it's considered the most dangerous. One of the statistics I read said that 40% of the people who attempt to climb to the summit don't make it, if you get my drift. Um, I really am a fan of DoSpace, so I love to read their mission statement, a community technology library dedicated to empowering our community through access to technology and innovative learning experience. They are in Omaha, and I hope that other people choose to duplicate what they're doing. It's an awesome program. For those of you who don't know me, I've been a trainer and consultant for the library world and allied institutions since 1978. We're the kind of people who live with over 3,000 books in our little bungalow here in central Denver. We don't have a television, haven't had one since 1986. We don't have magazine subscriptions. I'm active on social media to keep in touch with my clients and, family around the world and so on. But I am rabid about curating my social media. And one of the first things I do if I get onto a new platform is find out how I can mute people, how I can block people, what I'm looking for, so that when I log in, I feel good about what I can read. That doesn't mean that I curate out people who I disagree with. If someone is civil, it's great if we disagree. That's not the issue. Also, I think that one of the skills that my husband Leif and I have is we're really good at finding interesting, smart people from across the political and philosophical spectrum and all sorts of interesting fields. And one of the reasons we do that is so that if an interesting topic comes up, we can call one of our quote specialists. For example, I was finishing up a webinar and I had mentioned something about polling and why I didn't like polling very much, political polling. So one of the participants asked me a couple of questions and I said, you know who's one of the country's experts on it? My good friend, Kathy Bradshaw in Ohio, who's a professor in journalism who has studied the history of polling in the United States, and here's her information. So that's one of the ways that we keep on top of stuff. Also, so you know my bias is, I pretty much assume that most meaning every popular data news site is flawed in one way or another. There are no safe sites. Everything, particularly the ones that I think the most of, have to be viewed with skepticism. And I also, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about, I assume that most news doesn't matter. Most of the things that we see coming in the news doesn't matter. And I think that's one of the psychological, I don't want to say barriers, the safety net, if you want to call it, that we have to pay attention to in terms of information overload in the 21st century. So the key idea we have today, and every program I do has a key idea, is that you are responsible for enforcing your own priorities about life. Like if I was to create a target with circles, the innermost target, of course, is my husband. And then our extended formal and informal family, our neighbors, our friends, the people I care about here in Colorado, and then particular people I care about in the world about things. And when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I kind of go back to my core and remind myself what's important to me. What's important to me. And you know what? On busy days where everything feels crazy and I might log on and look at what's hitting me, if you want to call it that, from news sources and everything, I just have to hit that power off button and say, you know what? What's important to me today? It's not easy. It's a discipline, folks. It's a discipline. It's not something that you just think about it and happens all automatically. It's like practicing the piano or getting used to doing a new exercise or learning how to read a language. It's all about discipline and practice. So enforce your priorities, for me, is the most important idea having to do with dealing with information overload. So there's four things we hope happen today. One, that you start being able to eliminate or cut down unnecessary information, which really isn't an information. I want you to think about information in terms of things you can do something about, things that affect your life, meaning actually affect decisions that you have to make for the welfare of yourself and the people you love. Everything else is kind of gravy as far as I'm concerned. If you have a career, if you have a job in something, yes, it's important to keep track of what's happening in that bigger career, in the job market, and so on. In my career classes on resume writing, one of my mantras is everyone, if you're in the world of looking for, being a person who isn't retired with a ton of money, then guess what? You should always be looking for your next job, because we all know things aren't stable right now, but this has always been the case. I have people probably once a week emailing me and saying, guess what? I was just furloughed. Guess what? I was just laid off. And these are people with stable jobs. So for me, it's like you're always looking for your own next gig. So what you need to do is to be thinking about the data streams, the stuff that kind of whizzes by your eye that's interesting, and then what do you actually need to archive? I'm helping my husband's family deal with a bunch of stuff we found at the ranch this year. The last of the older generation died, and we're going through boxes and boxes of stuff. My husband has found a whole bunch of boxes of newspaper clippings and scrapbooks related to the oil industry that part of his family was involved in. And I contacted an archivist in Pennsylvania. We've been emailing back and forth, and we were sort of saying, yeah, isn't it interesting that there's all these scrapbooks of paper and all of that is already digitized, and we don't have to keep those scrapbooks anymore except for an archive. Um, that you are constantly improving the quality of the things you look at. And we don't spend enough time thinking about, this person said this thing, was it true? Right now, everybody in the world seems to be a trends forecaster or some sort of philosophical pundit who says this is what's going to happen in the world. But what they don't do is tell us, like at the end of the year, all right, I made 433 predictions and 7 of them were right. I don't know if they still do this or not, but in the olden times, before electricity, when Forbes Business Magazine had a paper copy, this is something interesting they would do. They would recruit people to talk about the stock market and investments. And each of those people got to have a page at the back end of the magazine describing what their forecasts were for the stock market and different investments during the year. But unlike a lot of places, what they would subject those people to is at the end of the year, they had to face the statistics of how well they did and comment on their successes and failures for the year. A lot of people went into this thinking, oh my goodness, I get to have this free publicity in the leading business magazine in the world. I always like Forbes better than Fortune. And isn't that wonderful? And I'm going to do great stuff. And it never really hit them emotionally that by the end of the year, they would have to say, oh, well, I said all this stuff and this is where I failed. A lot of people never signed up for a second year, never signed up. So part of what I want you to do is to be thinking about including people you like, especially people you like and agree with, when they say, the sun is going to turn blue on Friday, does anyone ever write that down and hold them accountable? So that's something that you can do. More time to actually act on data. You get this information, what are you going to do about it? It might be as simple as you read a new article about exercise or diet or gardening or reading or something, and it sounds, well, that sounds cool. But if you're so busy looking at the next best thing, you don't have a chance to actually implement the information we're talking about. And then that whole thing of unplugging, right? I don't have a smartphone. I think I'm one of the few people in North America over the age of 2 years old who does not have a smartphone. I have a ancient flip phone that I only use on the road so that my husband can contact me, and that's about it. So there's a whole bunch of applications I've never seen. We don't have a microwave. And for a long time, we didn't even have a fax machine. So I, I unplug in those ways. And also when I walk away from my laptop where I do the work for our business, I can go in the backyard, I can garden, I can get on the phone and talk to friends, I can focus on something else. So being able to unplug and smell the real roses is part of the way to think about information overload. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about the fact that it is not your imagination, that there's too much happening and it's too fast. That whole idea, and I'm a big fan of project management, that everything we do can start with a plan. You know, if you are going to buy a car, most of the people I know spend a little time planning. They figure out what features they want, what their budget is. They look at, God bless, Consumer Reports. Now there's a whole bunch of different websites. I recently had to look up some information about the family estate, you know, working on this. And I found there was a couple of new websites I had never even heard of to evaluate how good a car is and how much it might be worth on resale and stuff like that. People do that. They put a lot of planning in. Same if you're going to buy a house or condo. Same, I hope, if you plan to marry someone, you think about things. Well, guess what? When we're starting to think about information overload, it starts with a plan. Some things you might be able to do to kind of clean up your information house, how you look at things, how you hear things, how you store things, and so on. Looking for other people who you can trust, people who can be your editor, curator, and aggregators, people who you think have good taste and that they're not going to hit the mark every single time. But it's nice to think about, I like this person, I like how they think, and I'm not going to take it for granted. I'm not going to take, you know, what they say. I'm not going to be smug about it and let them be smug. But, you know, they're maybe going to be one of the first places I look. I have a friend named Stephanie who is a lawyer with a psychology degree and an expert on brain science, and she used to lecture all over the country. If I have a question or an interest in that subject, I'll peek into her very robust timeline on Facebook where she's posting stuff sometimes 20 times a day to look at what she thinks is right. And then I can send her something and say, what do you think, pro or con, and get her take. She's very, very fair-minded. I have a friend named Chris, and she's an expert on kind of the cutting edge of what's happening in medicine and science. I have another friend named Jim, who's an anthropologist who really has amazing insights about politics. So those are people we're going to be talking about that you find in your own life. The whole thing of the random walk and kind of getting out of our bubble in terms of making more room to look for things that are unexpected. Dealing with the myth of breaking news. And I have kind of an insider's view of the sausage factory. I have the equivalent of a journalism degree, and I've worked in radio, excuse me, in newspapers and magazines. Some of the people I worked with are award-winning journalists and newscasters, editors for major newspapers and so on. And once you start hanging around them and understand what the news is about, even before the kind of news streams we have on the internet, it changed the way we think of things, and then maybe thinking about some first steps to take. Okay, so first of all, it is too much, folks, and it's too fast. Okay, here's some statistics that I picked up. And by the way, in picking up these statistics, I often had to go to 5 or 6 or 7 sources, and the sources contradicted each other. And these were credible sources. These were credible sources like state agencies that are looking at local demographics and the Census Bureau and so on. You know, I didn't look at Fred's Acme population site. I looked at things that were credible and they disagreed. So take these with a grain of salt. However, how many scientific papers are published every year? 2.5 million. My goodness. My goodness. How many websites are there right now? 1.7 billion websites on the internet. Just in 2018, that's how many formal movies were released, okay, in Canada and the United States. How many scripted original television series? 495. How many active business pages are on Facebook? And that was a snapshot taken, I would say, about 6 months ago, 60 million. How many people are on Twitter? And boy, the way, this is sort of fun with Twitter because they are, how would you say, reporting what's happening in different ways. So the people I read about said probably this daily user Twitter thing isn't the best in the world, but it'll give you an idea. And even with the internet, 7,218 magazines were published in 2018. Oh my goodness, a little overwhelming, don't you think? So there's some theories about what's going on, and theories are just that. And in the social sciences, it's not like the laws of physics, so we make a lot of guesses. First of all, one theory, which I like a lot, and I ran into a few years ago at the beginning of the internet, is that people tend to be attracted to interaction, novelty, and surprise. We almost have an addiction to, ooh, tell me the gossip, tell me the new news. And there's a little bit of that in competition that I want to be the first to know, right? And that used to be a big deal. Even now, I will get emails from friends saying, did you hear this? Did you hear this? Or texts from them. Did you hear this? Did you hear this? Because it's sort of fun to be, oh, I was the first person to tell you, right? That whole thing of instant gratification, and that's very powerful. And they talk about it in behavioral science, that if you can get something instantly, that's going to be more powerful than something you get in 30 minutes or an hour or 3 hours. It's one reason, they say, why people are so likely to post stuff that they haven't checked. And it's embarrassing a little bit for me because I mostly work with libraries and universities. So the people who, for example, are on my Facebook stream are wicked smart people. I mean, they're great. And yet, almost on a daily basis, I see them posting and sharing stuff that simply isn't true. One of the sad things is that somebody will post news about a missing child or a missing animal or whatever, and in a case that was settled months before because they didn't actually bother to trace the link back. But there's something so powerful like, oh my goodness, and I got to be that first one. But another part of it is this issue called habituation. Habituation is about habit. And the theory there is the more we see or hear something and the more we get used to it, it fires off fewer synapses in our brain. Our brain's sort of saying, okay, I know that, I don't have to pay attention anymore. And it literally sort of disappears. We simply don't notice it. It's like, I grew up in Chicago, and for a time we had an apartment that was right next to the elevated, to the train tracks. And when you first moved into the apartment, it was incredibly annoying because it was like every half hour or so, a train would come by that was just a few feet outside your window. If you ever saw the movie The Blues Brothers, you'd understand what I was saying. But you know what? After a while, it sort of disappeared. You didn't even notice it anymore. Well, it's kind of like being an addict and needing a bigger hit. So it isn't as, how would you say, satisfying just to watch a news reporter from, say, the BBC or NPR, where they are taught to be as objective as possible. And so they're not going to use their voice and their mannerisms to say, oh, 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 they're just going to be like really calm and so on. And for a lot of people, that becomes, I hate to use the word boring. They want that excitement, and now we want more hits and more hits and more hits. And we need a bigger attraction. So in a very real way, we get addicted, particularly online, to more and more. And at the same time are complaining about the information overload. I didn't say that humans are rational. So first thing is, everything starts with a plan. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a good plan, and the information you might have at the time is damaged, but okay, we're going to have a plan, all right? So the first thing to think about, and I'm married to an economist, so he taught me this a long time ago, the amount of time we have the amount of attention we have and the resources, which include money and computers and books and everything, are limited. And one of the things about attention is that if you're like me, you only have a certain number of hours a day where something can get your full attention, right? I tend to get up early. I tend to put in a lot of hours. You know, there's an old joke about being self-employed and you get to work half time and it doesn't matter, 12 hours a day. So yesterday was a long day, started about 6 a.m. And I went up to my husband about 5 o'clock, 11 hours later, and saying, you know, it's not that I'm sleepy, but my brain feels full. I need to do something else, right? So I went in and chopped vegetables and made soup. I needed to do something else. So I have a limited attention span in terms of how much information my little puny brain can absorb in a day. I only have so much time, that pesky time-space continuum every day, and my other resources are limited, like how much money I can spend on something, or commitments I have to clients and friends and family as well. So a plan helps you prioritize what you need to do. So here's some of the things a plan might have. And when we talk about planning in terms of information load, it doesn't have to be formal. I'm not talking about you writing a novella. I'm just talking about you self-reflecting, right? To sort of be aware rather than simply be on automatic about how you deal with information in the 21st century. So what are the goals? All right, well, first of all, we start with the personal goals. I always start with your however you define family. And for me, family isn't just blood relatives. It's people who I care about, who I check in with. Some are local, some are in other countries, right? But there's that family tribe of mine, which is probably about 50 people who I care about. And one of the things we have to get away from, and I think we've done that, was the myth of quality time, where there was a time that said, well, it was really important with children, didn't matter how much time you spent with your kid, but you wanted to do something quality and meaningful, even though it was a few minutes. Well, to my satisfaction, that's been debunked because people said, no, actually, it really is not just about the quality, but just hanging out. It's the quantity of time. I have very fond memories of watching Chicago Cubs games with my dad on TV on Sundays. We barely spoke to each other. He would cuddle me, and I would watch the game and I'd be assigned to go get him a beer or get him chips or make him a sandwich. But it was just something we shared together that was really fun. So it's not just the quality time, but literally how we choose the amount of time we spend with the people we love. And then we wonder why we don't have that satisfaction relationship. Another part, if you are active in your career arc, is investing in your career advancement. Might be webinars, might be books, might be talking to people. I always think the first and most important thing is building your network outside of your current job and really thinking about your job and being self-aware and thinking that even with all the restrictions you have about where you live and what you do for a living and how old you are and your skill set, again, I think it's because of my own background as an entrepreneur, we're always thinking about what we can do next. So then we have what we might call professional. And professional is bigger than just the career. It's all those things you look at that have to do with not just career advancement, but ideas and information that are important to you in one way or another. And yes, this is where we're kind of looking for problem solving, for trends that might affect you down the road. I remember 20 years ago realizing that more and more training was going to go online. And 20 years ago, I hated webinars. I hated online training. So it was a big deal for me to make the switch, but I was ready because I had looked ahead. And then we have this thing called the commons, the greater good, what happens in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our communities. So yes, there's a certain amount of time I spend that, by the way, I didn't spend so much a few years ago, taking a look at things like city government and politics, using platforms like Nextdoor, which I probably log into once or twice a day, to seeing what's happening in the immediate neighborhood, which could be anything from crime statistics to somebody who needs help with something to someone who's looking for an opportunity. And again, I'm sort of building networks with real people. So this kind of gives you an idea of my plan. Your plan might look very, very different from this. Another thing is I want to be able to improve the success I'm having already with understanding information. So yes, I seek input from others when I'm doing this plan. Talk to them about how do you choose what you pay attention to? What's important to you? What's not important to you? Particularly when right now so many people I know who would be out there traveling, um, uh, working at their physical workplace, dealing with those sort of things, are at home or cloistered someplace, and they've had to change their priorities. Now, do I have a plan that's written out? Yes. And when I first put it together, I love office supplies, but I can stop buying them anytime. I would use big uh, 16, I think it's what, 18 by 24 pieces of poster paper, and I put them up on a easel that I have because of my work, and I would write this stuff out in big letters. I'm very visual, so I could look at it and think about it. I'd put it on index cards. I love colored index cards, so I could think about it and write about it. So yes, I kind of revisit this. I have these things on my computer now and take a look, and it helps remind me what my priorities should be. Another thing that we do, and when we had a team, we posted these goals physically for our employees, but it's something that probably my husband and I talk about every day. And one of the things that I use that we both use together is what we call our 3-task daily mission. And it's basically like, what are the 2 or 3 top things that we need to accomplish today? So I tell him, we work together in the house, I tell him, okay, this is what I'm working on now. This is what I'm working on for the next 2 or 3 hours. So after I do this webinar, I have something to write for our state library, and then I have some bookkeeping to do, and I have a master list I'm putting together, and I'm checking in with my husband. And every day, because this is how our relationship works, I give him 2 or 3 things that for the home or for the business, I say, these are the 3 things that I need you to get um, to do today, which is really good because he's always working on his big picture issues for his clients. And so he said, yes, you give me those things and I get them done. He's my buddy I report to, but if I'm working with a client or working with a relative on something, I give them daily check-ins. We're doing this big project with the Colorado State Library on training people in supervision. It's a big deal for us. We're taking a whole bunch of work and putting it online for the first time, and it's 10 webinars with a lot of people. So Christine Krieger at the State Library and I are sending emails back and forth several times, maybe even a dozen times today. And one of the things I say is, I'm working on this right now, and my next job is this. It's like I'm treating her like she's my supervisor. She's treating me like I'm her supervisor. It creates a structure that tends to calm me down because I know what I have to do this time and this time and this time. And yes, just like everybody else, I have those kind of interruptions, people knocking on the door, delivering packages, calling, sort of emergency emails that come in from clients. So I don't have a group of secretaries around me protecting me from the world. And then there's little things like, you know, dinner and gardening and such as well. And when I do well, I reward myself. My husband and I reward each other when something nice happens. I can email my sister-in-law in California and say, hey, this cool thing happened or something. I've noticed that a lot of people who are feeling overwhelmed and despair right now don't celebrate those small successes and don't reach out to people about them. They don't want to do that little brag. I love the little brags on social media. I love it. I just read something from a lady who just had a successful adoption of a rescue dog and was talking about her trials. And I'm a sucker for animal stuff. So I was saying, this is good news. This is good news. And then this whole idea, which is, we call it better substitution. And substitution is an idea from behavioral science that is great for behavior change because it's about, I'm doing this now, what could I be doing instead? And When my husband and I were first married, neither of us had really good diets. We had pretty good diets, but not really good diets. And I remember one day after a few years that he looked at me and he said, if you would be telling me 20 years ago that I would love eating roasted garlic with brown rice as part of dinner, I'd laugh at you. But what I would do is I would find tasty dishes that were healthier than what we were eating, but very tasty, and substitute them out. So I have a killer delicious, rich tasting lasagna that is made with all kinds of alternative ingredients. Well, the same thing kind of applies to life. It's sort of like what I need is delayed gratification so I don't get sucked into that, oh, I have to know minute by minute what's happening. And I have to make that short-term sacrifice that I won't be in that time loop and then think about what am I going to do with that time instead. And in behavior change, some of the mentors I have who are cognitive and behavioral scientists say for some things that are addictive, short-term gratification like eating and social media and breaking news, it can be hard to find something that will satisfy you emotionally as much as like, oh my goodness, did you see what's on the news today? And do I succumb? Sometimes, you betcha, but I'm better than I was about getting sucked in that way. So on my substitution list are family and friends. Like we were going through a difficult time a few weeks ago, and we decided the healthiest thing we could do was to check in on old friends to see how they were doing. And I ended up having a wonderful conversation for an hour and a half with a dear friend of mine who I had not talked to in 8 years, who was sort of the center of my universe in terms of work I was doing 25 years before. And it was wonderful. And I got off the phone with her. Her name's Jan. I felt great. I felt great. So we have been also hearing from people who've been taking the initiative with us. It's like, hey, haven't talked for a long time. I got a phone call from a friend from Arizona. I probably haven't talked to them in 15 years. Hi, how are you doing? Getting outdoors, and we're lucky because we live in Denver, Colorado, which is beautiful. If you're in Omaha or the greater Omaha area, I've been to your part of the world many times, and we're lucky because the great Midwest and the great Heartland has beautiful skies and beautiful scenery. I don't think people appreciate it. Physical activity, even if it just means getting up and walking around your version of the block. You don't have to go out and do a marathon for 23 miles. What you can do is get outside and do something physical. Maybe there's something you can do for someone else. Maybe not that big obligation, but something little. You know, like I noticed one of my neighbors has been terrific about contacting us once a week about she and her husband are going to the grocery store, something we can pick up, right? Do you need a bouquet of flowers? Do you need to borrow something? We have a lovely family who lives across the street, and we check in about once a day. Do you need something? Do you need something? And we sort of help each other that way. Maybe it's creation in meaning and purpose in life, making something. It might be a meal, it might be art. I think that's a wonderful thing about the 21st century. All the, what I consider positively addictive YouTubes about doing almost anything in the world. But the thing is not just to sit there and watch the YouTube, okay? Turn off the computer and actually try to make the thing out of paper mache. That's sort of fun. Maybe there's something that needs to be fixed. And I'll tell you, we are fixing a lot of things in our house right now. And this is something that is hard for a lot of people, including me. Maybe it means silence. Just maybe sitting indoors and outdoors, maybe even without music, without reading a book, and just sitting. I'm not talking necessarily about meditation, but just some kind of silence can be helpful. So then we need to talk about this idea of weeding. We're going to be cleaning up what we have. And what we're going to be doing is looking at what we did in the 20th century and what we do in the 21st century. So it's like that book that lady wrote that everyone was so excited about. If it doesn't bring you joy, throw it out. Well, yeah, that's one way of thinking of things, but there's a lot of other ways. And I would rather you personalize it to what's important to you and your values and how you live your life, rather than necessarily having someone impose their way of doing it on you. But here's some things to think about. The overload that you feel can occur when you're not managing your access to information, meaning really thinking about why I'm doing what I'm doing. For some people, it's building archives. Like, I'm going to somehow download, bookmark, note everything in the world I need. And we don't have to do that today. It's pretty easy to find things, even if they're not out there anymore. You can find caches and you can find old stuff. That whole thing of quantity, of I want to have the most information on a particular subject, well, that's okay, but it's changing very rapidly. I would rather have other people be collecting information for me and for me to have relationships with them and their websites and so on. And then not to evaluate in changing times how we're doing things. What may have worked for you 10 years ago or 5 years ago might not be working today. So I always tell people that you can't simply rely on how you did things before. And there's so many changes in society right now that we need to pay attention to. Another part of it, and this is why we have to get away from the computers and the technology. There's a book that a man named Michael Polanyi wrote. He was part of an amazing family of scientists and philosophers and so on. And the book is still in print, University of Chicago Press. It's called Personal Knowledge. And Professor or Dr. Polanyi, however you want to call him, came up with this phrase that people use a lot today: tacit knowledge. Those things that we know for which we don't have words yet. And he really talked about the importance of sort of a personal relationship with the real world, the physical world, and not just counting on words on a page or a screen to inform you about the world. And it's the whole argument we've been having for decades, even before we were having this discussion about music. It's the difference between the digital world and the analog world. The analog world is like the real physical world. And the more we get away from the real physical world, the more we lose nuances. So again, we don't want you to be so overloaded by the abstract, what you can see on a smartphone world, that you kind of miss the real world that's around you. So in the 20th century, when I would talk about these concepts, here's some of the things we would say. Proof of concept means that rather than just studying something, go do it, because you're going to learn a lot more by doing it than simply studying it. That we would discuss the physical resources people would hoard, and what does it mean that you have a book for 60 years and you've never read it, and so on. And the same thing having to do with broadcast media, relationships. And so instead, even in the 20th century, we would talk about creating links to people and projects and materials rather than the people and project and materials themselves. And even though we can create a lot of links today, maybe we need links to links or the general concept of what we need. I have a page that I update frequently on my website about ethics in libraries and in public sector agencies. It's amazing how quickly those links vanish and change, and how much time I have to spend now just refreshing one page with about 12 links. The last time I did this, I cut the number of links that I paid attention to by 1/3. Instead of having 40 things on the page, I now have 12, 8. But you know what? They're quality and they serve the purpose. They serve the purpose. A lot less work for me as well. But in the 21st century, the problem is that we don't have that nice safe limit of how much shelf space do we have anymore, so we get carried away. And I keep reminding people of this. I should have a tattoo that says, the cloud is just somebody else's computer. It's not some magical place in the ether where everything is safe and secure. It's not data heaven. It's just other people's computers. So simply counting on everything's going to be fine on those other computers isn't good enough. And it's interesting, as I develop my own resources, how much time now I'm spending weeding out stuff that maybe I saved 10, 15, 20 years ago because I could, because I no longer had the same limits on data that I had a few years ago. In social media, we have 3.5 billion people on social media. Maybe we need to spend more time liking things. I like to acknowledge people on social media because I want to help them out and I want to have them feel good and special and so on. But even then, I'm doing less of it than I used to because I have to think about what's the best use of my time and how can I support that person. Am I spending an hour and a half to support people who I will never meet and I won't have any interaction with? Is that the best use of that hour and a half in terms of what I can do for other people? And then that whole thing about thought leaders. Um, I don't follow thought leaders. I follow people because most of them I find are not very substantial. They have interesting philosophical ideas, but after a while they can become smug, they can be self-referential, and you're not getting new information from them over time. So in the olden days, I would just subscribe to a magazine for 1 year, and then I would get what I got out of the magazine and it would repeat itself and I was done. I think the same thing about thought leaders. If you have someone out there you really like, follow them for a year and then say bye and find somebody else that you can follow and get information from. How about managing this? If this is an issue that's a professional issue for you. In the olden days, we would take a look at, again, the physical limits and how much it costs to store things. How much it costs to store things. And I remember when a woman I knew became a state librarian. First thing she did, because the person she replaced had been the state librarian for 20 years, the first thing she did was to tell the staff to get rid of 25% of the stuff in their cubicles. Well, some of them got rid of a lot more than that. And I think that kind of spring weeding is important even in the 21st century. Uh, the minimalist approach, I really do like the idea that you don't take something in without getting rid of stuff. That also applies to thought leaders and sites that you follow, right? Keep refining, keep refining. And then finally, those information partnerships. I can't tell you how good they are to find people who are focused on those ideas, to check in with them. I don't think of them as thought leaders because they're doing more than pontificating about ideas. They're actually applying some uh, how would you say, supplying some intelligence to what they look at and what they don't. And most of them aren't pundits. Most of them are not trying to make a name for themselves in online journalism. They're just doing what they do. And finding those people who are kind of hidden behind a wall in an office sometimes are the best people to be looking for sure. So how do we manage this in the 21st century? Well, first, obviously, turn off the news. It's, you know what, it's real interesting. Try for 24 hours to turn off the news and then see how much has actually changed. I get so bothered by the fact that so many things that people say are wrong, and we're still doing the equivalent of correcting them on page 38 of the newspaper. And how much junk are we filling our brains with that way? And again, I don't care what your politics are because everybody does it. It's sort of like, I need to know something that's valuable to me. And to be able to cultivate a bigger picture for me is making more friends with a variety of people who are scholars and academics who aren't necessarily shook by something happening today because they're seeing and understanding the bigger picture about stuff. They're more grounded in their ideas of what's happening in the world. And to get people from different points of view, I think, is always really, really important. That whole idea of diversity by every single measure of age, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, political point of view. I am proud, I'm bragging now, that most of the people I work with do not share my political and philosophical views. So it really keeps me from being in a bubble because I'm constantly exposed to ideas that are different from my own. The current relationships, that contact database is really important in terms of individuals. And I do like the idea that I can easily find those people who I haven't talked to in years and reestablish a relationship, even if it's just sort of, as my mom would say, rubbing noses until we get a chance to meet again. And the whole thing of building new relationships, talking to strangers, looking for people who are new. And it might be someone online, or it might be someone who just moved into your apartment building in your neighborhood. And the older we get, the harder it is, I think, to seek out the new. And on top of everything, if I have a choice of looking at databases or seeking out new people, I will seek out new people. I will. So what's this meaning of what we talk about editors and curators and aggregators? I've sort of talked about this a little bit as we've gone on. Cultivating those experts, and we've kind of talked a little bit about them. What I think is important is not just to talk to people who are, quote, credible. You can't see I'm making air quotes right now, but people who are maybe outliers, what we sometimes call independent scholars, who might not have real world credentials, but have been studying something with discipline and depth, sometimes for decades. So don't just please be satisfied with what everyone tells you is the best mainstream, curated, vetted place to look for stuff, right? You kind of have to widen your peripheral vision a little bit. A lot of businesses and a lot of professional and trade associations have really good blogs and newsletters on a variety of topics. That's a place that I like to look for experts. And if my husband or I find someone who's written an article online, isn't it wonderful that now we can email the person and say, I loved what you wrote. It's so easy to reach those people now, and sometimes they're totally delighted, and sometimes it means a little more of a relationship where you feel comfortable saying, what about this and that, and talk through things. Think tanks that are out there across the political and philosophical spectrum, people in museums, people who work in archives, right, who have, again, a bigger view of things, and then generalists, people who, as we used to say, know next to nothing about almost everything, and tend to be interdisciplinary and see the connectedness of ideas. Again, we want you to look for new people. And if you're in a profession, to look outside your profession for people who have new ideas. What my husband and I used to do more than we do now, but we'd go to other people's conferences. My husband would look through the listings in the newspaper and he'd say, ooh, that looks like an interesting conference. And he would go to it. Or that looks like an interesting convention. And we'd pay the fee just to go into the exhibit area, just to talk to people. Like, what are you interested in? What do you care about, right? You find out so many interesting things. Used to be more popular that people had luncheons so that you could pay a little bit of money, go to someone's luncheon, hear a speaker, sit at a table with people who were different from you. And remember, refresh your resources once a year, see what you want to keep, what you want to change, and be very careful of media pundits. I'm sorry, I wish I could give you the names of people who I trust and like, and I can't. I don't know of anyone I can give you. So what about this idea of the random walk, We used to just call it browsing, right? To be able to diminish, in the best sense of the word, what you pay attention to, so there's room for the new. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to create a flower bed, but I'm not going to immediately fill it up with flowers. I'm going to leave some room for something new and unexpected. It's what libraries do that kind of upsets some people, where they build shelves, but they don't immediately fill every single shelf in the library with books, because they know there's going to be new books coming in that they want to make room for. Some people think, well, they should fill every single corner of the library with books. And that does happen sometimes. But a lot of people who plan for what they call the management of acquisitions knows that there's always going to be something new that they need to make room for. How are you going to make room for the new is one of the themes to think about with information overload. I think it's fun. And again, I was taught not to talk to strangers, but that was when I was like 10 years old. I'm taller now and I'm kind of mean. So I'm not afraid of talking to strangers. And there's a fun thing that used to be called the 250 rule, which is that every adult American knows 250 people by their first name. People who are old neighbors, old friends, family, the families of their kids, people they went to school with, people from work, people from their last 3 jobs, whatever, their dry cleaner, right? Their veterinarian, their dentist, their doctor. And so when you're talking to someone, you're not just talking to that person, you're talking to 250 people that that person knows. So the random stranger question is fun, and it's something I do when I'm teaching information management. I was speaking at a conference of travel writers up in the Rocky Mountains, and it was at one of our lovely ski resorts. And what we said was to come up with a technical question that they would want to ask someone as a travel writer, and then ask 5 people at random if they know the answer, and then come back to class and report. So one of the groups went out to lunch together, nice restaurant. Waiter came up, and one of the people says, "Hey, we've got this assignment for this class. We're trying to find out why the weather patterns in the Rocky Mountains are so hard to predict, because we know that that's something you read about, but why is that?" And the waiter said, "Well, I'm not the right person to talk to, but see that waiter over there? He's actually a scientist who spends his summers working at the resorts and his off time so he can get credits so he can ski for free in the winter. And he works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and I'll just switch stations with him." And so they got to talk to this guy who was like a leading expert in atmospheric research. And they came back to the class, told their story. Everyone applauded them. There were other stories as well. And they said, "Okay, we're sold. We're sold on the random walk." Um, I love used and new bookstores. I probably love used bookstores almost more than libraries, but don't tell my library friends that. Sometimes it means sampling academic journals, just playing the random walk online, or walking through an academic library where you can look at things. The thing I mentioned about visiting other exhibits and conferences, and then ask people you respect for new authors. We call it the author game. Is that you ask someone and say, "What's an author who's important to you?" Or you ask someone, "Who's somebody cool that you know?" Talk to that person and then say, and what's a book that's important to you, and who's somebody else new? So that's kind of a game that you can play to kind of refresh, particularly when we're talking about nonfiction books and ideas that might be interesting, might be new to you. So when we talk about the random walk in the 21st century, everything we used to do still works, except most of it is in the virtual world. My 2 favorite places to browse are Twitter, because I don't pay attention to the political arguments because life is short, but I do look for people who are columnists and bloggers who I think have an interesting view of the world and are good at aggregation, are good at coming up with, here's 5 things, here's 10 things, here's 12 things. Sometimes I find some good information. And to look at books, my favorite source is librarything.com, because many of us post our personal libraries there, and you can browse your interests. So you could look up the different libraries that I have posted of the thousands of books that my husband and I have, and say, "Oh, I kind of get a feel for the kind of things that Pat's interested in." I've actually made friends on Library Thing simply because I found someone who had a really interesting view of the world based on the collection of books that they had. Just thought it was very cool. So I would say that if there was one issue that I think addicts us the most and causes the most information overload right now, particularly with the crisis having to do with the virus, it has to do with breaking news and the myth of breaking news. The myth that something new and important is going to be told to you, and you have to drop everything and pay attention to this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. Breaking news is not quality news, okay? I have been in a newsroom. I worked in radio where you're having news broadcasts, particularly if it's an AM station that focuses on news and breaking news and so on. You're having things coming in through TV, through different kinds of wires. It used to be, it was on the teletype. I'm old enough that actually, you know, we would do the rip and tear and grab something and just run into a broadcast booth and just read off of the sheet that you just had at hand. And you're getting those reports in, and you may have 5 minutes to write up a news story from something that someone hands you, and then it goes excuse me, on the air. And probably in the old days, you would have news updates every 10, 15, 20 minutes. And you would just pray that the information you were getting was accurate. Because unless you had people in the field, you would have no way of telling if what you were sharing with people was right or wrong. So you would get reports of the death of somebody. You'd get the reports about a riot, a flood, a fire, and you wanted to be first with the news. But it wasn't, from my point of view, really kind of journalism. It was more sort of like um, a wire that would go from somebody's brain to somebody's mouth, but nobody ever could stop and say, well, let's see what's going on. And I can't tell you the number of times when I was in radio, and we were in the radio station that I worked for was in a big tall office building on the 38th floor in downtown Denver, and how many times someone would say something about the weather or something, and one of us would run to a window and look out the window and see if we could see the interstate or see if we could see something in downtown Denver or something that would tell us whether or not it was true. And people would be on the phones trying to track down a friend to say, you're there. Is what they're saying happening actually happening or not? And you'd have these people, and they still do, they're called stringers, who would be around every place, who would be there on the ground checking on things, telling you where things are true. Well, yeah, we got reporters out there, we have TV cameras and so on, but nonetheless, how many times in the last year have you been told something in breaking news that turned out not to be true? That would be an interesting project, particularly if you have young people at home, to put up a piece of cardboard, put up something on a wall, and every time you hear something that's breaking news that reports something, write it down, and then maybe cross it out with a big red pen if it proved to not be true in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, day, week, month, whatever. It's something that for competent police people, people who work in law enforcement and lawyers and such, it is the bane of their existence, because people want instant answers on who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, who's the criminal. We were following one news story this week, and from very, very, very credible sources got 5 different pieces of information that contradicted each other. About a year and a half ago, maybe a little longer, southern Colorado, where my husband's family have a ranch, was the center of a record-breaking fire. It was devastating. And we were counting on individuals, local authorities, and local news outlets to give us information about what was happening. And I quickly learned that they're not bad people, but the local news outlets were giving us the poorest quality information, that the best information was coming directly from local emergency services, the police department and the fire department, and friends who lived in the area who could look outside their window and say, well, I don't know what's happening in the territory, but this is what's happening in Walsenburg. This is what's happening in Levita outside the window. So that was a real lesson for me, and it kind of broke my heart a little bit, because I had a better opinion of those local news sources before this disaster happened. That whole thing of people, are they reporting information or are they interpreting information? The more adjectives and adverbs they're using, the less likely they're reporting information. And people who are in the news thing, they're just like anybody else. They want that great story. They want that way to deal with things. News sources are notorious for quoting each other without checking for themselves. It's not that they're lazy, they're overworked, and they have impossible deadlines to meet. And like I tell people, if it's real breaking news, it's about that wildfire that's heading toward the ranch. To me, that's what breaking news is about. A lot of other stuff, you can wait a week or so to see what happens. So, what are the first steps? Well, substitution works better than stopping. Make the list of the things that you love in life and use that list to substitute for your information overload rather than trying to stop dead. See if you can find in your part of the world local news reporters who are actually reporting different perspectives rather than stating their opinion and filtering the news according to what they believe and what they think is true. Get grounded on things that I think are important. Look for stuff about invention, the arts, history, big picture stuff, science, so that you have more of a sense of perspective on what's going on. And then I really hope that you go to live events and go talk to human beings with your cell phone off. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I wanted to see if we, when we need to stop broadcasting, see if my producers and hosts behind the scenes are checking at things. What I thought that I would do is take a look and see if there are, oops, here we go. Let's see. I'm going to take a look and see if we have some chats here. Okay, and okay, I didn't see any questions. This is very good. Okay, and like they say, if you have any further questions, feel free to use the chat service on DoSpace. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to DoSpace as well.